So I'm up here at the top of Parriott Mesa. You can kind of see the scenery around me here is pretty slick. It's very, very pretty up here. We're at about 1,300 feet right here. Sorry I haven't checked in for so long. I've been busy with, as you can tell, all kinds of just crazy stuff. I fell in with a really cool group of really wild people, and I'm doing like some of the craziest shit I never thought I would be doing this kind of stuff in my life. I always thought people that did it were really cool. I never saw myself as one of those people that would ever fall into this lifestyle, and yet here I am. Needless to say, I'm so fucking grateful. Like, I went through a really long period of depression. It was pretty rough. And when I finally got down to the bottom of it, this is where I'm getting into some weird spiritual shit, and some people are gonna zone out on me, but what finally pulled me out of it was I started watching these videos about the law of attraction, and it kind of just became immediately apparent to me that, like, you know, the last 10 years, they've been absolutely amazing. I mean, I've just been a feather blown in the wind. No plan whatsoever, and just complete hedonism, you know what I mean? And I loved it. It was amazing. But after a while, without having an aim, obviously you become aimless, and without, I guess, identity kind of gets confused or something. I don't know. It's hard to explain all the psychological things that happen, but I've learned that I really needed to refocus and like kind of imagine what I want my future to look like, so that I can actively connect with that future. And so far it's been amazing, and everything has just been kind of falling into place. And it seems like I meet the right people at the right times and have the right experiences and come across the right information and have just the right inspiration out of nowhere. Definitely like in a flow state, so to speak. I had a whole bunch of different ideas for films that I was throwing around for a long time, and nothing ever really came from any of them because I don't know, I feel like maybe I just didn't fully connect with what I was trying to talk about. But one of the things that I feel like I really connected with was basically the idea that I need to do a film about the bicameral mind. And I'm betting, even as I say that right now, most of you have never heard of bicameral mind theory. So I was going on a blind date, and we decided we were gonna meet up at Barnes & Noble, and I'm not honestly normally a bookstore person. So anyways, I'm there, and I'm early, and I'm kind of just browsing while I'm waiting, and this book just kind of captures my eye, which is odd that it even did, but maybe it was just the simplicity that did make it stand out. But it's just like a plain white cover and just very simple text that said, "The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind" by Julian Jaynes. And this book, like, honestly changed my life. It really did. Julian Jaynes was a clinical psychologist. He mainly worked with people who had visual and auditory hallucinations. So that would be like schizophrenia and what they called back then multiple personality disorder, which is now called dissociative identity disorder. Everybody has multiple personalities, and we all hear voices in our head. But what separates us from these people with these different types of neurosis is that when we hear that voice in our head, or those voices, they all tend to have the same voice, and it all seems to sound like our own voice, and we associate that with ourself, and that is our own internal dialogue. But when you think about it, it's actually two different personalities, completely distinct or more, which is how you're able to hold opposing views and argue with yourself. Basically, I mean, we've known this, I think, for a pretty long time, that like consciousness, if it does originate in the brain, which I actually don't think that it does, but that's a whole other story. But assuming for the moment that it did, it seems to like not come from one singular area. It's like you have an area that controls anger, and a part that controls lust, a part that controls hunger, and all these different areas that control like different kind of like archetypical emotional type personalities, I guess, subtype personalities. So we hear those voices in our head, and they all sound like our own voice, and when we hear it, we just say, "That's me. I'm talking. That's me talking to myself in my head, my own internal dialogue." But people who have schizophrenia or dissociative identity disorder hear those voices and they dissociate them. They hear them as other than themselves. So interestingly, if you go way back in these different religious traditions, most religions in the world started out as being polytheistic. There were many gods, and they all tended to be very archetypical and revolve around emotions such as hunger and anger and lust, just like what you see in dissociative identity disorder and schizophrenia and things like that. If you look at the oldest humans, we have like a common ancestor with apes, and then the fully modern humans. And in between that, like you have the oldest one, which has like literally no frontal cortex to their brain at all. They're basically an ape brain. And then you have modern humans, which do have a frontal cortex and prefrontal cortex, our brain. And then this whole gradient in between those, as that was actually building and forming and being created through the course of evolution. And so you have this whole gradient of experiences. The oldest humans, when they first started experiencing what we would now call consciousness, they didn't have a theory of mind. They didn't have a sense of self. There was no self to identify with. So when they hear these voices in their head, there's no way they could possibly associate it with themselves. So every voice they hear in their head, they dissociate. And so it's the gods speaking to them. And so that was how they first experienced consciousness. It was as like basically these dissociated voices speaking to them. And then if you fast forward a few thousand years, and now you start to see the emergence of monotheism all throughout the world, as the neocortex and the frontal cortex and the prefrontal cortex are starting to be built inside our heads. You start to see monotheism everywhere. Everybody now hears one singular voice in their head, just this one God. And then you get to modern day humans, and we just hear our own voice in our head, and God has stopped talking to us. But really, that's God was just a part of the evolution of our consciousness. You know, I think every religion in the world more or less has it wrong, but a lot of the religious books from which those religions were derived from were technically just people keeping a record of history as best as they could, and communicating things they could with the limited vocabulary they had available to them. Like, imagine you had something that you understood intuitively, but there was no word that described it. It was just something that you knew intuitively. And there wasn't even any like surrounding words to sort of like hint at, right? I mean, the question then becomes like, well, what would you do to communicate that idea? And I think what it was for these more primitive people with limited vocabulary was that they would narratize it. They would have characters that more or less play out these kind of scenarios that attempt to kind of encapsulate the idea that they're talking about. You know, and then the religions come along and they take some of that stuff literally at face value. And it's like, you know, if you listen to Mother Goose rhymes and you take them literal, you completely lose the meaning. And in fact, it'll make no sense at all. It'll just be this weird story, and it would be weird for anybody to believe in it. That's what happened with a lot of religions. If you take it as it was intended, which is basically metaphor, like trying to hint at an idea there wasn't words for, then you have a new respect for a lot of these stories. And so you hear these, you know, some of these ancient texts talking about the Alpha and Omega. Always has been, always will be. We're all a part of it. We all came from it. We're all returned to it. I mean, couldn't they just be talking about literally the universe? All of creation, the creator, right? I mean, of course, they anthropomorphized it. They turned it into a person, and then people started taking that literally, and then people lost sight, I think, of the idea of God, which God is just like the all, the everything, this one singular living thing that we're all a part of. Like that we're literally just a bunch of drops in the ocean, but the real actual thing is the ocean when we put us all together, and that is the universe, the big ocean, right? Anyways, bicameral mind theory. I'm gonna make a film about it. And that was inspired first because as I've gone online so many different times trying to like get any of the people that I respect as intellectuals criticizing or praising or even mentioning it like in passing, bicameral mind theory, like nobody's talking about it. And it blows my mind because to me it seems like just intuitively a correct theory, or at least moving in the right direction. And the thing is, I wouldn't mind if everybody, all the intellectual heroes that I've looked up to that I really want to interview and get their take on it, completely tore it to shred. I just want to hear them talking about it. And I want to introduce that idea into the public psyche at large and let other people look at it and think about it. And it could reframe the way we all think about consciousness and the way that we think about religion as a part of the evolutionary process of consciousness. You know, the thing is, God and Jesus and the saints and Mary and all this kind of stuff, for some reason, for thousands of years, it was a very useful metaphor for communicating these ideas. I think science nowadays still doesn't 100% have the language to fully explain, and we don't fully understand all of this. yet. But at the bare minimum, we could probably update our metaphors. And so that's what I want to do with my film.